live.
Good morning and welcome to our live Money and Mental Health Policy Institute event today, where we're going to be discussing problems with the universal credit system that are leaving hundreds of thousands of people with mental health problems struggling, unable to access support from loved ones to manage their benefits. For those of you who don't know, the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, we're a research and campaigning organisation. We're here to try and better understand and tackle the link between financial difficulty and mental health problems. And at the heart of our work is a research community of 5,000 people who all have personal experience of mental health problems and who generously share those experiences with us every week. Our work looks at every aspect of the relationship between money and mental health, which has included looking at different parts of the benefit system in the past, from the 5-week wait to the level of benefits to the general accessibility of the system. But today we're talking about a specific issue that the research community have raised with us over a number of years, but has received very little attention. So we decided it was time to share a spotlight on it in particular. We know that hundreds of thousands of people with mental health problems are accessing or using the universal credit system, but struggling with the day-to-day admin that's needed to manage their claims. So that's things like responding to emails from the DWP, making telephone calls, understanding notifications. And they're struggling to set up support from a loved one who might be able to help them to navigate it. Because in order to set up a supporter, you have to navigate many of the same complex systems that people are needing help with in the first place. It's a ridiculous system. I have to admit, when the team first told me about it, I thought, this has to be a mistake. Surely it's not actually set up like that, but it is. So our research today explores the way the system works and what we think needs to be done to change it. A little bit of housekeeping for today's event. We are absolutely delighted to have over 500 people registered and watching today. You can watch live streamed on our website and on YouTube. It's always such a shame that we can't get together in person. We hope that we'll be able to soon, but we do really want to hear from you. We don't want this just to be a one-way broadcast. So underneath the screen where you can watch the broadcast, you can see a link to our Slido page where you can submit questions and take part in a poll that we'll be doing a discussion around later. So please do submit questions. The earlier you submit them, the better. We always get a lot and we don't get through them all. So please do send them in and we'll answer as many as possible. We're also really honoured to have a fantastic panel of speakers today. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, but I'll tell you more about them in a minute. So perhaps most importantly, we're joined by Gary, who's a member of our research community. Gary's going to be sharing his personal experiences of navigating the universal credit system. I'm very, very grateful to Gary for doing that this morning. We're also joined by some friends of Money and Mental Health. We're very grateful to have Tom Pollard with us today. Tom is a benefits policy expert and a mental health social worker, and who also has some experience working within the DWP. So he's going to be able to give us invaluable insights about how we make some of this change happen. Rachel Gregory's from Christians Against Poverty. Rachel's going to be able to give us some insight into what it's like as an organisation or an advisor trying to support people through the system and the difference these changes could make. And we've got Laura Bennett from Carers Trust, who can talk to us about her experiences and her understanding of the impact this is having on carers. And we've got our very own Nikki Bond, who's been involved in writing this research and carrying out a lot of the underlying research in the report. And Nikki's going to talk us through the findings as well. But before we hand over to them, I wanted to welcome our founder and chair at Money and Mental Health, Martin Lewis. Many of you will know Martin, who established Money Saving Experts, which is the UK's biggest money and consumer website. It's got 14 million viewers. You probably see Martin on screens slightly bigger than this one, because I think he's currently got 2 ITV shows, which seems a little bit greedy to me, but we just wanted to give Martin a little bit more screen time. And actually, there is nobody more passionate about this, which is why Martin set Money and Mental Health up in the first place. So I'm going to hand over to Martin to do a little introduction, and then we'll welcome our other speakers. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Helen. Good morning, everybody. I don't plan to go too much into the detail of the campaign, as the team are the ones who've done all the work on this. They're the ones who have the technical expertise, not me. But I did want to set the scene, if you like. When I first set up Money and Mental Health, one of the things we quickly discovered is there aren't really any villains here. There are no bad guys to get your teeth into who've been deliberately out there targeting those with mental health issues so that they can make life difficult for them. Actually, what happens is nobody's really thought of it. Nobody's really tested the situation for the individuals and realized that not everybody can work in the same way. And this is a classic one of those issues. We call it set up to fail, but I don't want to imply for a moment that there's deliberation in the fact that people have been set up to fail, claiming universal credit. It's just the system's too difficult and too complex, and it hasn't been thought of. Catch-22 was a wonderful novel, but it isn't a great situation for people to live in. And the fact that the forms to ask a loved one to be able to help you with your universal credit claim are so difficult, you need the same loved one to help you with your universal credit claim, but they can't because you haven't filled in the forms for them to help you with your universal credit claim, is like a farce. But unfortunately, it's that farcical reality that people are living with. So what we want to do today is really set out the meat in the sandwich, if you like, of exactly how that works and let you see from lived experience what people are dealing with. But the bigger point that we need from this meeting is, first of all, we need you to help us put pressure on government to change this and to change this as quickly as possible. We have a post-pandemic, we hope, situation coming up soon where furlough is going to end, and that's going to mean more universal credit claimants and more people facing this difficulty. The sooner we do this, what is hopefully a non-contentious change. I can't believe that the state or anybody wants to stop individuals with mental health getting the universal credit that they're due. This is a bureaucratic issue we have to get through. So we need to push government to change it, and we need your help to do so, both verbally, understanding the issue, lobbying, and also signing the petition and getting those people in your organizations to sign the petition. The link, Brian tells me, should be somewhere on the bottom of here. If not, you can find it on the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute website. This has always been a difficult one for us. Since we set up the charity, we have been nervous about benefits. I need to be honest on that, because the benefit situation is automatically a political situation. How much benefits people should get, how much state supports each individual. And as an apolitical charity that's trying to work with all parties and you know, we're only 5-6 years old, we're still dealing with the low-hanging fruit. To get involved in the benefits issue is one we thought long and hard about. But this issue for me isn't political. It's simply fixing a bureaucratic problem that hasn't been identified before, and that through the power of our lived experience community, people with mental health who tell us the shit they're facing, if you want. That's why we're doing this particular campaign, and that's why we need your support on it. My hope is it's one that we can get fixed relatively quickly. And we were certainly happy to help the government and the state design the universal credit system, or the forms for the universal credit system, just to make this easier. A few small changes could make a massive difference. So please listen to the wonderful speakers you've got who are going to give you the technical lowdown, the individuals who'll tell you the life story. And at the end, we're not doing this just to entertain you. We're doing this because we want your help in the campaign to try and make a difference. And I think that's all you need to hear from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Very, very much appreciated. Yes, as Martin said, as we're going through the discussion, as well as submitting your questions and taking part in our poll, please do sign the petition and encourage the government to act. We're going to talk through in some more detail during the meeting exactly the things that we're calling for, but we would really love your support, as well as your insight and challenge in the questions as well. And that poll, we are asking you, what is the thing that you would most like to see DWP doing to help people get access to support with the benefits system? So please do let us know your thoughts, and we will read out the results to feed into our panel discussion in a bit. But next, we're going to probably our most important speaker, Gary. Gary is a member of the Money and Mental Health research community who has experience of depression and anxiety. Last year, Gary was made redundant after 23 years in work, and this was when he first applied for universal credit. He's found the universal credit system to be confusing and impersonal. He relies on his wife to help manage their claim, and he says he wouldn't have been able to persevere with the system if it wasn't for his wife's support. We always try and involve people with lived experience in our events, and we always try and do it in the way that they are most comfortable with. So this interview with Gary is pre-recorded and without video. It's an audio recording, and we will be back on screen with you as soon as it's finished. So I'm going to hand over to Gary.
Thank you for talking to us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Thank you.
So I just wanted to ask you a few questions after you've spoken to us about your experiences of claiming universal credit. You mentioned that you find it very confusing to manage your universal credit account, including the online process. Can you tell us a bit more about that and why it's so difficult?
Basically, we had to rely on Google and do our own research as to how you go about the whole process. I was always told everything must go from a work coach, but then after about 7 months, my work coach says, no, that's not correct. You should have been using other things. You get other choices, other categories, but none of them seem relevant to me. They're just the explanations they give you when they do reply they just make no sense. They're just too they're too matter of fact. Nothing's in layman's terms, if you understand, and it really does leave you absolutely no better off when you reply.
Yeah. And are there parts of that process that are more difficult than others?
Yeah, I would say, well, no, to be honest, we know the whole thing is complicated from start to finish, regardless whether you want to, from processing your claim to asking questions of limited capacity, work-related capacity issues. They don't explain what's the difference is, why you don't get paid for this, why you're not entitled to this. Nothing is, it's just so cloudy, and you just really don't know who to ask. Like I said, I'll be asking all my questions to my work coach, and she eventually, Mark, says, well, why you keep asking me?
Okay, that sounds really difficult. I'm thinking about that you previously said to us that your wife helps you to maintain your universal credit claim. Yes. Can you tell us a bit more about this and why her support's so important to you?
Initially, well, it's a joint claim, so obviously we sit down and do it together. But initially I didn't think it would be too bad, but once I started doing the claim, I just didn't know how to answer correctly, because I thought, if I say this, say the wrong thing, is it going to cost us? I wanted to be honest and was honest, but there was a lot of things that I think, well, the actual type of questioning needs to be rejigged. It's, from these elongated questions, what you have to, I had to read 5 or 6 times before it sunk in. And then my wife, she's really clever, she can see things a bit clearer. So we discuss things together, you see. And basically, we're at the point now where she deals with the journal. I just can't cope with, I obviously get the notification because they won't allow that to go to my wife, even though it's a joint claim. And anything money, questions and things that we need to ask, I just get her to do it. It might seem a bit cowardly, but the whole process has left me like this at the minute.
It's not cowardly at all, Gary. It sounds really difficult and really complicated.
Yeah.
So it's a joint claim. And you mentioned that you weren't given any guidance from the DWP about how to get help from your wife with your universal credit account. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
There's no options, or there's no possible area that you could say, look, I'm struggling with this. I mean, they must know it's a joint claim. Your husband and your wife sit down and do it together, even though on the form you have to, they're expecting the other person to fill it in. But when it comes to asking questions, notifications and things like this, everything comes to me. Nothing can go to my wife, because Well, I suppose that's just how the system's set up. And there's a lot of occasion when I do need my wife to answer for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the difficulties are that you're getting all of the alerts and notifications, but you're struggling to act on those, and then you're kind of passing it on to your wife, but kind of that's not something that the DWP allow or kind of makes possible within their system.
If they do, I have never seen it, and it's never been offered. So as far as I'm concerned, it was never an option. Yeah,
of course. So, thinking kind of a little bit wider, if you could make a change to the universal credit system that would make it easier for you to get help from your wife, what would that look like?
I think there needs to be more help, at least at the start of the claim. You say, would you like to nominate an individual like your wife, a friend, another family member, or just somebody who's familiar with the system to guide you through it? And allow that person to help. Sometimes even maybe they get a question or something like that. You know, asking about you via somebody else. It just takes that pressure off. Because if I was doing this on my own, I absolutely know categorically I wouldn't have bothered claiming. I'd have just, after the first an hour. Now, bearing in mind that the online thing, we spent maybe 1 to 2 days mulling over it, going back, trying to fill it in, and to me, they all know who we are, where we are, and we're out of work, and yet you have to do this process, and it's soul destroying.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Gary. It sounds really difficult, and that you've kind of really tried to kind of navigate the system and get help from your wife, but that's really tricky with the system as it stands. That's really helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to add about kind of bits you found difficult or kind of things that you've come across within the system?
Well, there's still plenty to talk about regarding the whole system. Like I've said before, it's designed to trip you up and fail you. I've likened it over the past few weeks to getting a flat pack piece of furniture with no instructions. It's just, I didn't realise how horrendous it was. And I think the system could definitely be revamped. It should be revamped and to help people. We don't become redundant because of our choice. They should be offering support to that individual and helping them, not relying on us to inform them that we've been made redundant, so to speak.
That's really helpful, Gary. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Huge thank you to Gary there. I know that isn't an easy thing to do, and we're enormously grateful that he took the time to talk us through the challenges. And I think that kind of example of it being like a piece of flat pack furniture with no instructions is exactly what we have seen in our research. It may be that all the parts are there, and it may be that they all fit together if you've done it before, or if you're well enough to Google how to do it. But for most people, that isn't the case. And so most people end up with a system that really isn't working for them. So thank you, Gary. That was incredibly informative. And I'm now going to hand over to the other voice that you could hear on that recording. So that is Nikki Bond. Nikki is a senior researcher at Money and Mental Health, and Nikki was the author of the report that we've launched today. Her background's in financial services, where she worked supporting people with mental health problems to manage their finances. And prior to that, she worked in social care, advocating for disadvantaged and marginalised groups. So Nikki brings a wealth of experience to this issue. And today she's going to talk us through what we found in our research and the recommendations that we've made. So over to you, Nikki.
Great, thanks, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Great, thank you. So today I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour through our research. The findings presented today are based on research with over 230 people with mental health problems who've claimed universal credit. And you can read the report in full on our website after the launch. So experiencing a mental health problem can make it harder to manage a universal credit account alone. Symptoms of mental health problems such as depleted energy levels and motivation, short-term memory problems, and difficulties understanding and processing information can make it challenging to complete the regular tasks involved in managing your universal credit account. Regular tasks can include communicating with the work coach, keeping up with notifications, as Gary mentioned, and responding to messages from the DWP. Add to this, the move from old-style legacy benefits to universal credit has placed additional responsibilities on claimants to be active participants in maintaining their claim for universal credit. And claimants are expected to monitor their account and complete tasks within specific timescales. For some, the symptoms of mental health problems can make completing these tasks tricky, and for others, it can be an absolute impossibility. So, to understand the challenges within the system, we looked at different tasks involved in maintaining a universal credit claim, and specifically the parts of the process that people with mental health problems find particularly difficult to navigate. We found that 2/3 of survey respondents found it difficult to understand the online explanations about how their universal credit payment had been calculated. Almost half found it difficult to raise queries or questions online. And 1 in 5 found it difficult to simply add a note to their journal, which is the main channel within the online system for liaising with the DWP. So these tasks are basic tasks that everyone who manages a universal credit account is expected to navigate on a regular basis. But people with mental health problems are finding this incredibly tricky. The challenges people face with these tasks can arise from symptoms of mental health problems, which make navigating the system difficult, but they also arise from pain points in the system, which have not been designed in a way which is accessible to people with mental health problems. So moving on then to the consequences of struggling to kind of keep up with these tasks, failure to keep up with a basic task like these to maintain your claim can have devastating consequences. Sanctions and deductions can be applied, or entitlements are lost altogether. This can mean people struggle to meet their essential living costs and buy food and pay rent. The quotes on the slide from members of our research community describe how flaws in the system around notifying claimants of messages and appointments and warnings about lost entitlements can be missed altogether when people are experiencing acute episodes of mental health problems or fluctuating mental health problems. This in turn can aggravate mental health problems and delay recovery too. So, faced with these challenges and the devastating consequences, people often rely on family and friends for help. Our research found that over half, 57% of survey participants said that they needed help from family or friends to manage their universal credit accounts. And of those, just under half had always or often needed support. So this isn't a kind of a small problem that's only affecting a small number of people. So looking at the challenges of getting help to maintain your claim and touching a bit more on some of the things that Gary talked about, we looked at the options for getting help with your claim. And the primary mechanism for getting help is by giving the DWP permission to liaise with a third party on your behalf. This is a process known within the system as delegating explicit consent. In our research, we wanted to explore just how accessible and appropriate the current options are for getting help with maintaining your claim. So I'll talk you through some of the challenges people experience, primarily with the explicit consent model, but our report goes into more detail about the problems people with mental health problems can experience with the other third-party access mechanisms too. So, despite being crucial, getting third-party help with the universal credit is a difficult and confusing process. Only 1 in 10 survey respondents had managed to give permission for someone to help regularly with the tasks involved in maintaining their claim. Almost half had circumnavigated that process by sharing their universal credit online login and password account details with a family friend to get help to maintain their claim. So we looked at what the challenges were in giving consent for a family member or friend to help maintain your claim and found 3 key problems. Firstly, the options for getting help with maintaining the claim are not clearly promoted. So people don't know about the different options for accessing help. And even when the DWP know those people who are vulnerable, even when we know people are vulnerable and might benefit from help, they're not signposted to different tools they can use to get that help. Secondly, there's no explanation where in the universal credit system claimants should record their consent for giving permission to a third party. And this leaves claimants guessing where best to provide this information within the system. And finally, providing sufficient information online to delegate consent is almost impossible. There's no guide anywhere in the universal credit system that sets out what information is needed to set up a third party to help you. So the specific information you need to give explicit consent is incredibly prescriptive, but the details of this can only be found by navigating away from the universal credit online system and going and searching out this information yourself. So giving permissions online requires claimants to navigate the very tasks and demonstrate the same skills which led to them requiring assistance in the first instance. And therefore, if claimants can't navigate the main system, they're unlikely to be able to navigate the process for accessing support. There are alternatives for getting help with managing your universal credit account, but many of these don't work for people with mental health problems either. So where people are unable to access help via the online explicit consent model, in theory, they do have two other options. The first of which, claimants can give verbal consent over the phone, where an advisor might be able to prompt the claimant to provide the exact pieces of information they need to be able to be successful to delegate somebody else in that moment. However, our previous research found that more than half of people who'd experienced mental health problems had serious difficulties using the telephone. So relying on telephone consents as an alternative to overcoming the challenges of an online system is therefore insufficient. And secondly, there's the option of an appointeeship, which we go into in a bit more detail within the report. But this is where a third party is appointed by the DWP to make and maintain a universal credit on behalf of another person. Appointeeships are incredibly valuable and powerful tools, but they're intended for people who lack the relevant mental capacity to manage their account. So appointeeships ultimately strip claimants of autonomy and privacy, and even to the extent that the benefits are received by a third party. Therefore, they're often not well suited to people with mental health problems who retain relevant mental capacity. People with mental health problems are therefore falling through the gaps in the third-party access system. The explicit consent system is too arduous to successfully navigate. The telephone system is often inaccessible, and appointeeships can infringe on people's privacy and their autonomy too. People with mental health problems told us that they needed a system which allowed them to get help to maintain their claim while maximising their rights to privacy and autonomy. So we looked at understanding all of this and the challenges people experience and what people want. We looked at how this system can be improved and how people can get help with maintaining their claims via a system which is both accessible and balances their right to privacy and autonomy. Before the pandemic, the government said that they'd explore how to improve the explicit consent model, but these plans were placed on hold due to COVID and have not been picked back up. Given the huge level of needs and the financial damage that can be caused by an inability to get third-party support when it's needed, the DWP should urgently resume the stream of work and implement the following changes. They should make the explicit consent mechanism easier to use by introducing drop-down menus that prompt people to provide the specific information the DWP require to liaise with a third party on a claimant's behalf. Secondly, they should introduce a help to manage service. There's already a help to claim service which helped 100,000 people to make a claim in the first 6 months of operation. So the government have acknowledged that people need help with the system. But getting onto universal credit is only part of the problem, and people often need help, as we've demonstrated, to maintain their claim too, not just to get on it. The government should invest in a help to manage service to help vulnerable claimants to maintain their universal credit claim. And finally, the DWP should proactively target vulnerable claimants to raise awareness of the third-party access options. They could do this through a new vulnerability marker that they're bringing into the system in the summer, which identifies within the system customers that they know who are vulnerable, and they could proactively make them aware of third-party access options so people have it in their mind. Or they could do it through the existing help to claim service, where advisors can identify vulnerable claimants who may struggle to maintain their claim and make them aware of the improved options for third-party access. But our recommendations go beyond improving and promoting the existing explicit consent model. We propose the government should go further and ensure all vulnerable claimants are supported and they're helped to get support from third parties in a way which protects both their autonomy and their privacy. Our report sets out a suite of recommendations to address this, but to touch on just two, the DWP should develop a system of view-only access for authorised third parties, allowing claimants to share specific screens with a friend or family member. And secondly, they should introduce a system of duplicate notifications to authorised third parties, alerting both the claimant and their third party about new messages or tasks within their account. And this avoids a problem we saw earlier from a member, a carer within our research community, who said that their sister had missed all the notifications because she was experiencing mental health problems and was unable to use the computer. So duplicate notifications would support people whilst maintaining their privacy and autonomy. As the move towards universal credit continues at pace, change is needed more now than ever. The DWP need to ensure the system for accessing help to maintain a claim are accessible, they're well promoted, and they balance people's rights to autonomy and privacy. This requires urgent action if the DWP are to avoid people experiencing entirely preventable financial harm and detrimental impacts to their mental health too. There's an army of carers, friends and family out there trying to help people manage their universal credit system. Some relatively small changes would make this possible. Without them, claimants with mental health problems are being set up to fail.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you, really appreciate it. And please do take a look at the full report and have a read of the recommendations that are in there. There are some other really important areas that we haven't had time to explore in depth today around appointeeships and changes to make the system itself easier so that fewer people actually need that kind of support. And we asked you in our poll about some of the recommendations that we've made, and the results are quite interesting. So what did you think are the most important things for the DWP to do in order to support people to get access to help with managing their universal credit claim? The most popular, with 52% of the responses, was to give people more options for different ways of sharing information with their loved ones. So, for example, a view-only option on accounts for third parties or sending those notifications to someone else. And it's interesting that we've been having almost exactly the same conversation with banks, who are also looking at trying to set up that kind of information sharing, because it's not always the case that we want to hand over all responsibility for our finances. Just because you're struggling to engage with the information that you're given doesn't mean that you're not able to make decisions for yourself. So I think that's a really important change. The second most popular was making the actual system easier to navigate, and that's vital. I mean, that's the equivalent for Gary of, you know, if you're not going to provide the instructions, we also need to make the furniture easier to assemble. So it's not just about making sure that people can get access to support. It's also about making sure that the system is as straightforward as it can be. And then the third option was providing better information and guidance for people who want to set up third-party options. And 20% of people thought that was the most important thing. And as Nikki said, at the moment, there just is no information. So it would be a fairly small change that could make quite a dramatic difference to people. So thank you to everyone who responded to the poll. And thank you to everyone who's sending in questions. We've got plenty of questions coming in ready for our discussion, but please do send more in, because it's always good to hear from as many of you as possible. I'm going to introduce our panel now, and we will go into our discussion. I'll introduce all three panelists, and then we have an opening question for each of them, and then we will go to questions from you. So first, I'm going to introduce Tom Pollard. So Tom is an independent expert in mental health and other social policy issues, and has over 12 years of experience in a variety of roles, including 6 years in the policy and campaigns team at Mind. In 2016, Tom was asked to join the Department of Work and Pensions on Secondment as their senior mental health policy advisor, with a roving brief to work on a range of different policy and delivery issues. And after 18 months in that role, Tom left DWP and spent 2 years training and practicing as a mental health social worker. Alongside his frontline work, Tom's continued to write extensively about benefits and employment support for people with mental health problems and disabled people more widely, including as an associate of the think tanks Demos and New Local. And we're very grateful to Tom, because I also know that Tom rearranged a shift as a social worker today to actually come. So thank you, Tom. And I'm also going to introduce Rachel Gregory. We're really delighted to have Rachel here today from Christians Against Poverty. And I should say that Christians Against Poverty raised this issue with us about the need to support better third-party access to the benefits system quite a long time ago. And we've been looking into it ever since then, because I know it's an issue that's come up in their services. So we're very grateful to CAP for their insight on this one. Rachel joined CAP as a creditor liaison officer, so she was originally negotiating payment plans with clients' creditors. So she's got that really valuable frontline experience, but quickly moved to be a founding member of CAP's external affairs team and has grown their policy influencing activity, works with industry and government stakeholders to share insights into the challenges faced by people living in debt and poverty. Rachel is also currently chair of the Cabinet Office's Fairness Group communication subgroup, that's a mouthful, which brings together government departments and debt advisors to improve communication with people in debt and signposting to advice, which is both really useful insight here, but also a really useful channel to raise some of these important issues. And finally, we'll hear from Laura Bennett. Laura is the Carers Trust's lead on policy and public affairs in England and the UK Parliament. She's worked for them since 2015, initially leading on championing young carers' voices with decision makers and leading the sector in implementing legislation for young carers and young adult carers. Laura undertook a secondment to the carers policy team at the Department of Health, so some more invaluable government experience there, supporting with the development of the carers strategy. Laura has wide-ranging experience within the voluntary sector and is also a carer to somebody with a mental health issue, so has some personal experience to bring to bear today as well. So I'm going to ask an opening question to each member of the panel, and then we will open it up for discussion. I'll go to each of you in turn, but then when we open it up, do feel free to answer each other's questions, jump in. It's never quite as relaxed on Zoom as it is if we were actually sitting around a table, but don't feel the need to be too polite. So Tom, in your work as a mental health social worker, we know that you see the challenges that people experiencing mental health problems face when using the universal credit system all the time. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've seen some of these challenges identified in the research play out in real life? And I'm also really interested to hear from your experience working in DWP, what are the barriers to fixing this? What do we need to know?
Thanks, Helen. So first of all, I wanted to thank Nikki and Money and Mental Health for such an important report. And for me, it's a really perfect example of what Money and Mental Health does so well, which is identifying specific issues that may seem quite niche or very specific to an outside observer, but have a really significant impact on huge numbers of people living with mental health problems. And then the organisation works tirelessly towards really clear and workable solutions. And in some ways, it's kind of the opposite of the big sweeping gestures I usually make in my work, but I think it's such valuable work. So working in frontline mental health services over the last few years, for me, it's only reinforced how significant benefit issues are for many people living with mental health problems. You know, I knew these things loomed large in people's lives from my work at mine at DWP, but to be honest, even I've been surprised by just how much it shapes the day-to-day experience of people living with mental health problems, and also how much time it takes up for professionals, which effectively means one arm of the state is costing another arm of the state a lot of money, which seems so futile. For lots of people who use secondary mental health services, particularly those people who've been under services for a long time, as well as the impact of their mental health itself as set out in the report, there's often barriers around digital literacy, access to the internet, not having English as a first language. And for those seeking support from services, it's often because they have no one else in their life to help them. So I'm really glad the report mentioned support from professionals alongside family and friends. I'm not sure the people I support would describe me as a loved one, but I hope I'm still helpful to them. So I totally support the recommendations made in the report. I think what's key is that these are built around really clear and explicit principles based on people's wishes and lived experience. And in some ways, the opposite is true at DWP, and that's what Martin alluded to earlier. They, when designing universal credit, took this approach called a minimum viable product. So basically designing UC with a standard claimant in mind. And so these types of issues haven't been properly considered, and then people have to battle for concessions to make the system more responsive to specific needs. And DWP then claims these are hard to kind of bolt on to the existing design. So I really hope they are willing to make changes, the changes recommended in the report. But the difficulty in achieving these sort of reforms speaks to much deeper cultural and institutional problems in the way DWP operates. And so finally, I think it's worth reflecting that as important as these changes would be, they are in large part trying to mitigate the negative impacts of an approach to social security that doesn't understand the needs of people facing additional barriers such as mental health problems. And so rather than just making the transactions of the current system, like responding to journal messages and meeting a claimant commitment, easier to manage, we ultimately need to move towards a much more relational approach where people want to engage with the support on offer because it's appropriate and helpful and personalised and empowering. and creating an environment where people feel confident and secure to do so, rather than being driven by fear of losing vital financial support.
Thank you, Tom. That's really, really helpful to hear. And I think you're absolutely right. It's very insightful that the universal credit system was built around the average, or probably above average, consumer, which is exactly the opposite of what we advocate should be done in terms of designing products and services, particularly when you consider the nature of the needs of the user group who are using universal credit. Definitely firmly believe that you should be designing products and services for those who have the greatest needs, and in doing so you'll create a service that works better for everybody. But that's a conversation that it seems has been missed by the DWP. I'm going to go over to Rachel for a question to you now, and then we will come back to Tom as part of our discussion. So Rachel, advice agencies like CAP play a huge role in helping people with the universal credit system. And as Tom very rightly pointed out, not everybody has a loved one or a professional that they love who is able to help them to navigate the system. How do the issues in the report affect your clients, and what difference do you think the recommendations would make for your engagement with them as professionals?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point Tom makes. Over half of the people we help tell us that they don't have anyone to go to with a problem in their personal network. So a lot of people are battling this alone. As you say, we have seen this massively within our services right since the start of universal credit rolling out. We were very much aware that the system we had under legacy benefits, implicit consent, where we could show we knew enough about the claimant and their situation, and the type of information we were asking for was in line with our role, and we would be given certain pieces of information that we needed, just does not simply exist under universal credit. And the practical challenges working with people around getting explicit consent has been huge. Lots of people don't have digital access, find it very difficult to post on their journal, and you have to put such a specific note about the information to share, and it's very time bound. It's just till the end of the next assessment period. So it's been incredibly challenging. And that's even at a moment in time where only 1 in 5 of the people coming to us are on universal credit. And that number is only going to grow. And it's really important. We need this information to give accurate advice, check people are getting the maximum benefit entitlement they could be, and help people bring their finances back under control, because a really large number of our clients, about 4 in 10, have payments being taken directly from their benefits to repay debts, which can often be very considerable amounts that we might need to help them reduce. And so I think the report is really thorough, really good presentation of the challenges people are facing in different settings with this same one issue. And I think what's really powerful about the recommendations is that you really recognise that one size isn't going to fit all. There are a range of different people, different organisations with different roles, and they will need different levels of third-party access and control, as you rightly point out, in different settings. And I also think that point around helping people to self-serve as much as possible, a read-only view would be amazing. But I think it's really important to recognise that actually a lot of the information is not even provided to the claimant. We really struggle with people not being told on their journals what the outstanding balances are, where other debts might be in the background because the maximum number are being deducted already. And so actually making sure claimants are provided with as much information as possible to really understand their situations and be able to share that with third parties is really incredibly important.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really insightful. And I'm going to come over to Laura, and then I'm sure we'll come back to you on many of the points that you've raised there. Laura, we've seen throughout the research in Nikki's presentation that carers are a huge and important part of this story, but we haven't heard as much perhaps from the carer's perspective. So I'd be really keen to hear from you about what it's like as a carer faced with these barriers to providing support. And do you think the recommendations in the report would help, or is there more that you would like to see change?
Thank you. I think it just speaks to the fact that I don't think we're building helpful enough systems that work for both people with mental health problems and carers alike. And that still seems to be an issue that we just haven't been able to get to grips with. And I think Money and Mental Health's report really highlights those challenges that both carers and people with mental health issues face. And I should say that carer is a term that we use, and when we're using that term, we're talking about people's friends and family, and very often we don't use that term about ourselves. We talk about being someone's daughter or someone's wife, for example, but it's a helpful term to know about so that you can potentially use that. It can open some doors as well. And I think there are additional challenges to being a carer with somebody with a mental health problem. In the report, if people haven't had a chance to read it, there's an excellent table outlining some of the kind of cognitive and behavioural issues that people with mental health issues can face that are very real. These are real health problems, and it affects the way that you process things and that you can interact with the world. And as Gary outlined so brilliantly earlier. And I think one of the big challenges that carers tell us they face is about navigating systems. So the amount of work that carers have to do behind the scenes, getting different bits of the system to talk to each other, getting appointments to happen on the same day, getting people to phone you back at an appointment. And this is just an example of all the kind of juggling that carers are having to do behind that scenes. It was great to see that carers' voices are really coming through loud and clear in Money and Mental Health's report. And I think the suggestions seem to me to be really appropriate. They're about access, they're about time limited, they're about review, and I think that will really help both unpaid carers and people with mental health problems, because potentially even acting in ways that people feel are in good faith, people can put themselves at risk. So they can put themselves at risk of allegations of things like financial abuse, purely through, as the report describes, those kind of workaround issues of giving someone your password, asking someone to go and do something for you. Those are the kinds of issues that can just mean that isn't things where it should be. So it's great to see this report, and I really hope that that the DWP will be able to implement those recommendations.
Thank you. Laura, actually following up on a point that you made there that I think is really important. We were very keen when we were doing this research to understand the risks of financial abuse. I'll come to you, and then if it's all right, I'll come over to you, Nikki, to understand a bit about what we looked at here. But I'm interested to know what you think the risks are of people being open to financial abuse, and whether some of these changes help, or whether there's a risk that we, leave people open to more abuse by sharing more permissions.
It seems that the recommendations you're proposing in the report are very time limited, and it looks like they'd be available in certain circumstances as well. So, for example, there'd be an option just to receive information, or there'd be an option to kind of be involved in the helping process. And I really like the idea of the help to manage as well as the help to claim. That seemed like that was a really sensible idea. And I think I suppose it's just about the fact that carers can be just in a difficult situation with people with mental health problems, partly because of there can be lots of kind of shame and stigma around having a mental health problem, and it's not easy to ask for help. It never is, and it's not easy to have to ask someone who you're close to help you as well with those things. So just having a prompt in the system to potentially say, yes, I might need someone to help me with that would be really helpful. As well as I think it would also give carers that standing with when they're talking to those DWP advisors on the phone, to be able to say, yes, hello, I'm the recognised person, please can you discuss this with me, because this person isn't well enough currently to do that. And I think and the report also makes this very clear as well, is that we're not necessarily talking about capacity, we're talking about well-being and the ability to have that control over our finances, and that should be timely and when it's needed. So when it's not needed, the person can manage it themselves, but when it is needed, that somebody can help easily, because it's as we all know, it's difficult enough living with a mental health problem as well, and the system should really be trying to help us and the people who love us, rather than get in the way of those things.
Thanks, Laura. Nikki, I know you looked at some of these issues in the research. Can you tell us a little bit about what you explored from a kind of policy perspective?
Yeah, of course. So obviously, when you're kind of looking at options for delegating consent within any system, risk of financial abuse and fraud are at the forefront of kind of any of those considerations. And I think the thing that kind of, and that's kind of a lot of the impetus behind the move from implicit consent that Rachel mentioned in legacy benefits to explicit consent in universal credit. It's basically intended to give people to comply with general data protection regulations to ensure that people's privacy is not being breached. But the recommendations that at the moment the explicit consent model is inaccessible to people with mental health problems via the online route, and inaccessible also via the telephone route for lots of people. So our recommendations really look at making lots more the levels of access more granular, which actually reduce the risk of financial abuse. So instead of kind of giving somebody wholesale or kind of access to a certain piece of information via the telephone, actually allowing people to kind of view one particular screen and specify what screen that is, or what page within the journal that is, or actually saying I need some help, but I don't need you to give this person all of my information or give them any information about me. All I need you to do is to send them a notification when you send me one. That's not breaching, that's not kind of infringing on my privacy in any way. That's just helping them help me. So I think by breaking down different levels of access, we're actually reducing the risk of financial abuse as opposed to increasing it.
Thanks, Nikki. That's definitely a conversation we've had within banking services as well about, there's definitely a parallel where we found that many people are sharing PIN numbers and passwords for online banking with friends, family or carers because of difficulties using some of those essential services. And actually the abuse risk of failing to provide good supported third-party access mechanisms is much greater than providing a formal system. Thank you. We've had a few questions coming in around the issue of mental health training. So mental health training for work coaches, and a question about mental health training for the Help to Claim team as well. Tom, I wondered if I could come to you first on this one, just around, so the first question is, how do work coaches tell whether a person has mental health issues and whether they believe them? What training do they have? We've had somebody else say, I support people with mental health issues, and I think there should be a mental health education program for all DWP staff. I know that there has been some training and there's been conversations about improving that. Is there anything you can share with us about where that's up to and what you think the challenges with that have been?
Yeah, so there's often been a big focus on, within DWP, well, can't we just train people within the system better to recognise and understand mental health? And I think that is obviously important. And at the moment, the way the system works is that when you apply for universal credit, you have the option of kind of flagging up whether you have any health or disability issues that may impact on your ability to work. And that's supposed to then take you off down a slightly different sort of strand. I'd say the problem is that while it's good if work coaches do have a better understanding of mental health and are kind of told that this is an important thing on the agenda, the system often pushes them in different directions. And ultimately, it is a very process-driven system and a very process-driven department. And it's hard within that for kind of the human side of things to break through, if I'm honest. When I was there at the department, I found it very frustrating that, essentially 90% of what it does is administering a huge benefit system, and the kind of stuff around the edge to help people to engage with that better is seen as quite periphery to the kind of core task of administration. But, as we've been saying, a huge number of people trying to use the system have additional barriers, and it should be kind of core to the design process. What happens instead is that, there are some efforts to kind of engage with people with lived experience and do some kind of user-led design, but it's not very well done, if I'm honest, within the department. And it's done further down the line once a lot of the system is already in place, and then it's very hard to retroactively fit this stuff onto the current system. So there are improvements that can be made, but as some people have suggested in some of the questions, I think there are kind of more fundamental problems at play, which are always going to make it very hard then to kind of rectify what essentially is a system that is not designed with this group in mind.
Thanks, Tom. And actually, as somebody has put in the questions, could the DWP have a standing experts by lived experience group to advise and help with some of those design challenges? You're saying that is there, but they're brought in far too late in the process.
So it's a really weird situation where often the department is not able to directly engage with claimants as part of kind of their research, and they often have to commission external agencies to do that research because it's seen as some kind of conflict of interest, that those people are both kind of the intended target for their policy design, but they're also customers of the system. So there isn't as much direct engagement with people with lived experience as there should be. When it is done, it tends to get commissioned out to research agencies. And when it is done, it often seems like it's a bit of an afterthought. It's, how can we tweak this current system that is largely kind of set in stone to make it a bit less difficult for these people to navigate, rather than how do we design it to make it as effective and supportive to this group as possible. And that's a big culture change that needs to happen. And the reality is that for a long time, people with disabilities and health conditions were kind of off the radar because they were kind of shunted onto incapacity benefit. And the benefit system, the kind of more active benefit system that used to be job seekers allowances, now universal credit, wasn't designed with that group in mind, because they were seen as they weren't seen as unemployed, they were seen as inactive.
Thanks, Tom. There's two issues I'm going to come back to there on follow-up questions around how we persuade the DWP to pay attention and what we actually do now, given we've got this system. But before we go there, I just wanted to open that question up to others on the panel, particularly Nikki. I know that issue about training for work coaches is something we've looked at in the past. Is that something that came up in this research? Did we engage with it in the recommendations, or have we just decided that that's not the answer here? And then Rachel, somebody has asked a question to you around the Help to Claim team. I don't know whether you know if they have specific training in mental health awareness, or how advisors have training to support people as well. So first I'll come to Nikki and then over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, you're right. We've made lots of recommendations around training of kind of work coaches in the past, and mental health training, and we've looked at, in a lot of detail, at what the training programme is within the DWP, and kind of what the enhanced training programme is too. And I think it did come through in our research, particularly in the qualitative data, where people said, where I had a particularly good work coach who kind of understood my challenges and kind of intuitively did so. We had some really lovely examples of amazing practice. But equally, I think that's about individual advisors rather than being built into the system, that's the way in which people are supported and treated. So I think I think mental health training is one part of the solution, but I totally agree with Tom that the system was designed for an ideal claimant, and all of these things that we keep adding on to make the system easier for people with different needs and mental health problems specifically, they then become hard to access in their own right. This isn't the only mechanism that people with mental health problems need to access. That's hard to do so. So I think it's about ensuring that the workers are trained, and that's built into the culture of the system and built into the processes, but also making sure that people can navigate that process, and that the services are designed with those people in mind, and really thinking about, when we're adding these extra things on, can people access this, and is this sufficient to meet their needs?
Thanks, Nikki. And Rachel, that question about mental health training so the question was specifically about mental health training for the Help to Claim service, but I would also be interested in your views on mental health training for advisors who are supporting people with the system more broadly. Does it exist? Is it good enough?
So there's not a question I know the answer to for the Help to Claim system, but I think more generally, we have seen a real increase in the amount of training that is being delivered on a whole range of different sort of vulnerability issues, particularly mental health in recent years. I think that what is so key, though, is understanding not just identifying and how to encourage people to speak openly and comfortably about mental health problems, but also what that means for them. What support needs do they then have? How does that impact on them? And I think sometimes we haven't made that jump across to then actioning and understanding what do you need to adapt in your service to do that differently. And I think for advisors on the front end, that's incredibly difficult to do if the systems or your processes you have to follow don't give you the flexibility or the tools to actually put some of that support into place. And I think that's what we're seeing within this system. It's one thing to know that someone's having challenges, but if you've got nothing productive to offer them and empower them and help them manage that situation with the help of someone or themselves, you hit a brick wall. And I think that's the two parts we need. We need that training on the front end, but we also need the backup that allows people to do something positive with that information when it is shared.
Thanks, Rachel. That's a great point. And something we've found in other research about the mental health system actually is, we've looked into the extent to which people talk about financial issues when they're accessing mental health services, and the extent to which people disclose mental health issues when they're using financial services. And we found that unless there are good processes in place where professionals know what to do with the information, they're much less likely to ask the question, because it almost feels irresponsible to know that somebody's struggling and then not be able to offer them any help. So it does have to be both.
Yeah, and I think if I can come back in on that,
yeah.
I think that's an incredibly valid point within the universal credit system, because as Gary shared, a lot of the conversations are happening frontline with the work coaches, but actually their role is not really financial. There are head office phone line teams that will deal with the debt sides, particularly of people's claims. And actually, for people accessing the system, they don't have that division in mind. And I think there does need to be a greater join up between the front line where people are raising these financial concerns or showing signs that perhaps some extra support and advice would be needed, that read across happens and it isn't just shunted into a different part of the team and department.
That's a great point. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to ask, we've got a few technical questions coming in, so I'm going to ask a few of the more detailed questions before we go into the big issues of the political appetite, how we make it happen, and the universal credit system. Do we tear it down or fix it as it is? But the technical questions, firstly, Laura, there's a question here that I'm hoping you might be able to help with, which is where a young person can't register as a formal carer. So we've got somebody answering who I think is in full-time education, and they would like to register as a carer for their parents with mental health challenges. What support or resources might be available for them? Is that an issue that you're able to comment on at all? Oh, I think you're on mute, Laura.
Apologies, I was also saying I didn't quite hear the question because there was a bit of a wobble in the space-time continuum.
That's okay. So this is from somebody who says where a young person can't register as a formal carer, for example, because they're in full-time education, for their parents who have mental health problems. Are there any support or resources available to help them?
Yeah, it sounds like there might be a bit of confusion there. So young adult carers generally can't be in full-time education and claim carers allowance, but that isn't the same. So there's something called the 16 hours, the 21 hours a week rule around study and claim the benefits, but that isn't anything to do with getting support as a carer. So that person, if you go to our website, which is so it's Carers Trust and it's carers.org. If you pop in your postcode, you can find your nearest carer service, or you can Google your support for young carers. You're absolutely entitled to an assessment of your needs, and potentially that might help get the person that you support some help as well. So and sorry, Helen, what was the second part of the question around what support?
Oh, that was it really. So it's about getting access to support and resources. Thanks, Laura. That's really, really helpful. And I hope to the person who is listening that you will go on the Carers Trust website. And I know that there is a huge amount of invaluable information and resources on there. We have a question about the vulnerability marker that you mentioned, Nikki, and I'm hoping I can come back to you for a little bit more information on that. I know the vulnerability word is something we go back and forth on this all the time because I hate it. And as many people who are working in the sector will also be familiar with this debate, there is no such thing as a vulnerable person. There are people who are vulnerable to some things at different times in their life because of a range of different circumstances, and we can all be vulnerable at different times. And having a marker put on you to say that you are a vulnerable person can feel like an uncomfortable thing. But sometimes in some systems, it does feel like an effective way of getting additional support to people. So Nikki, the person who sent this question says, do we think the DWP are more likely to help if people are flagged as vulnerable, even if that word does feel infantilizing? So on balance, does this feel like a good move?
Yeah, I mean, I totally take on board, the kind of the concerns with the term vulnerability and all of that you've kind of just covered. I think within the system, having a way of identifying claimants who are particularly vulnerable at a particular moment in time, I think is a good thing. I think it's a good way of targeting support at people who might need extra levels of support. I think it's imperfect, as all these things often are, but I think we really need to make sure if we're not going to get to designing a system that works for people with the highest level of need, as we often advocate, and then therefore it works for everybody, then what we need is a way where the people who need that extra levels of support are identified, and that those and additional support is kind of proactively offered to them. So our proposals around the vulnerability marker are, the government are rolling this out in the summer. You know, they're going to have vulnerability flags vulnerability markers on people's accounts, so that they can identify those that people who are struggling. And I think just notifying those people who we know might be struggling with some mental health problems or cognitive and psychological difficulties, that there are ways that you can get a third party to assist you, is just one way of promoting this mechanism that can actually people can get help via, which currently people just don't really know about, and are just kind of in the dark.
Thank you, Nikki. Does anybody else want to come in on that before we move on to our next question?
Yeah, hi, it's Laura from. I don't think we're awfully mad about the use of the word vulnerable either, but I guess it's about having something that a system can look at. And I think it brings us back to our earlier point about the need for the system to be working as well as that training, because I think we know that there is still stigma and misunderstanding of mental health problems. For example, we know that lots of people don't understand them, they don't believe that they're real, and that will be nonetheless true of people who work in the DWP as it is in wider society. So I think if there's something where it's almost just sort of, if there's something within the system that can just be used, then it prevents people from having to have those endless conversations of trying to prove themselves, trying to tell, you know, and that's something that carers and people with mental health issues tell us alike, is the amount of times I've had to tell my story, the amount of times I've had to say why this is a problem, the amount of times I've had to ask for help, ask the system to work in a particular way, say, yes, it's fine for you to talk to this person. All of those kinds of things I think will just make it easier. And you know, it's really important that we remember that mental health problems are genuine conditions. They are something that we can go to the doctor for, there's something that we can get therapy and treatment for. They're genuine conditions. So we shouldn't, as a system, as a society, be making things harder for people who have mental health problems than any other condition. I think that is a particular part of mental health that is different from physical health.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to ask a couple of other small questions, which were, so one is a very welcome question from Gordon Cairns, who's watching online, who says he is autistic and chair of the West Cheshire Autism Hub, and he would like to know whether these recommendations can be rolled out to autistic people, including people with comorbid anxiety and depression. Our recommendations are based on the needs of people with mental health problems, but not exclusive to people with mental health problems. Nikki, do you want to say a little bit about how this might help people with wider needs or other kinds of needs?
Yeah, of course. I think, you know, our research is based on people's experiences with mental health problems, but these challenges, many people with lots of different conditions are experiencing. So making it easier to give permissions to somebody else to help you with your account has got to benefit everybody. You know, it's not just people with mental health problems that might struggle to use the telephone. There's lots of reasons that people might struggle to do so. And at the moment, having a system that pushes people to use the phone to give kind of a one-off consent for somebody to have one conversation with your carer is kind of insufficient. Our recommendations will make the third-party access system more accessible to and benefit everybody, but also it will really align. Some of our wider changes would really align with people's need to kind of protect their privacy and their rights to privacy and their rights to autonomy. And at the moment, I just think the system is kind of too far departed from that. And our recommendations to look back at kind of grounding the system in what people actually want and preserving their privacy and autonomy. So it would benefit all claimants.
Thanks, Nikki. Gordon, I hope that reassures you that this is intended to encapsulate that broad range of experiences as well. Tom, I have a question here that I think you might be able to help with about experiences of the universal credit system in general exacerbating debt and mental health problems, and specifically looking at the issue of excessive deductions from people's universal credit payments. Is that something that you've seen in your frontline work or in your time working on benefits policy?
So the deductions thing isn't something I've had a huge experience of in frontline work. It's something I'm looking at the moment in relation to what happened during the pandemic, in particular, with huge numbers of people making claims for universal credit for the first time, and the whole issue around whether people have to wait 5 weeks for a first payment or whether they take an advance, which then is deducted from subsequent payments. So I think there are lots of really significant issues with universal credit, as I'm sure everyone's aware. I think this is another area where, again, there's so much of the design which is notionally built around this idea of kind of a standard claimant, but also kind of built around some kind of quite explicit values around kind of wanting to kind of prepare people for the world of work. So things like having your payment monthly and having it in arrears. And I just think some of this just betrays a lack of understanding of the reality of people's lives. These are people who have generally had work and have had the privilege of kind of not having to fall on the benefit system for support, telling people who are in much more difficult situations what they need to do to be more like them. So I think, again, I know I always come back to kind of criticizing the fundamentals here, but I think there are some big fundamental kind of empathy gaps between the way the system is designed and created and the reality of people's lives. And ultimately there is, Martin alluded to this at the start, but there are some questions about the benefit system which are kind of treated as being purely political. So how much money do people get, for example? And my argument is I don't think that is a purely political question. I think that's a policy question, because the amount of money you have and whether or not you're in debt and whether or not you're struggling to get by has a fundamental impact on your health and on your ability to kind of manage processes and your kind of cognitive capacity to deal with stuff. There's good evidence that the stress of kind of scarcity and being in poverty makes it harder for you to manage these sorts of processes. So it is a policy question. It's a question of what do people need in order to thrive and flourish. And so I think part of the problem here is the debate has become very politicized, but in a sense, it's a bit of a false politicization where within the department, the question of kind of how much money people need and what the impact of a deduction on their payments going to be is treated as a question for politicians rather than a question for genuine policy debate, which is what I think it should be.
Thanks, Tom. That's really clear and leads us very nicely into our two big meaty questions that I want us to get stuck into. So the first one is, essentially, we've talked quite a lot about the fact that we're looking at some specific changes here to a system that was fundamentally not built for the needs of people with mental health problems. Michael, who is watching, who's a mental health social worker, has said, are there not wider and more fundamental issues with universal credit? It is by its very nature judgmental and punitive for people with mental health difficulties. And I think that sums up a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So we know the system was not built with people's needs in mind. It is the system that we have at the moment. Is it right to be making recommendations about changes like improving third-party access to the universal credit system at the moment? Or should we be calling for the universal credit system to be scrapped? Or are those two things not mutually exclusive? I want to open that up to the whole panel. Would anybody like to volunteer to go first on that one? In the face of silence, I will pick somebody. Tom, go for it.
So I think, as much as I've got sort of focused on, big systemic problems, as I said at the start, I absolutely think there's a role for kind of more forensic specific recommendations and engaging with the kind of minutiae of the system a bit more in order to make it better for people with lived experience. It's all very well me saying, this needs to be fundamentally redesigned, and I completely believe that. But day to day, that's not going to make a huge difference to people with lived experience until that stuff happens. So I think these things can sit comfortably side by side. I think there's a really important role for organisations like Money and Mental Health to kind of do this work and to engage with civil servants and politicians to try to make these kind of incremental changes that will have a fundamental impact on people's lives. But I think what's important is that those two things are done in a way that speaks to both agendas. So I think it's possible to say this is a problem that needs to be fixed, but also in doing that, when you're talking to politicians and civil servants, discuss why this has happened in the first place. Why have we got to a place that these things haven't been considered, and flag up those kind of more fundamental issues with culture and process of design, which has led us to this place. So I think those things can be done in tandem, and I absolutely think there's kind of a role for both of them. You're muted, Helen, sorry.
Had to happen at some point. Thank you. Who would like to come in next?
So I think very similarly to Tom, I think there is an urgency to these matters, and we look at how many years we are into universal credit when the trials began, how far we are off the full rollout, and I think that there is an urgency to fix some of these problems now rather than face many, many more years before we perhaps have something that could be better. But I think as well, there are some really deep cultural or priorities that we need to challenge more than the specifics of a system, because I think potentially anything that came in its place could have the same failings. And I think particularly we need to challenge this digital only or digital first angle, where we know that's difficult or impossible for many people. And I think also there's an issue where we look at things too much in isolation. Even within universal credit, talking about the issue about debt deductions, there is interaction between that and other welfare policies that will reduce people's entitlement, particularly for their housing costs. And when it's the two come together, that the worst hardship is experienced. And so it isn't necessarily just about fixing the problems within universal credit. It's about how much we take into account everything that's impacting that one person and addressing someone's situation holistically. And that's where we're falling down currently.
Thank you, Rachel. Nikki, you were also about to come in, I think.
Yeah, I think just to agree with kind of what everyone else has said, really, that, I think these things need to be addressed side by side. There's absolutely fundamental problems with the universal credit system. And we've seen, kind of campaigns around increasing benefit levels and kind of the 5-week wait for universal credit. And they are fundamental problems. But And kind of, I think there's lots of merit in Tom's argument around kind of overhauling the system. And we've called at different times for different big system change like this. I think with this report, we really wanted to reflect what we were hearing from the research community. But right now, people are struggling to maintain their claims because they can't get help. And I think we can do both of these things. We can campaign for these really niche little changes right now, which can be done and make a huge difference, whilst also campaigning for that fundamental change that needs to happen more widely.
I'd also add that I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with devolution around this as well, because benefits policy has already devolved in Scotland, for example, and it may be that that's something that the Senedd also wants to take on from the UK government. It sort of always feels a little bit hard for me to see how the government can justify why people with mental health problems or people in Scotland or who live in Wales, for example, have different systems and different needs to those who live in England, for example, and that's not something that seems to be the case. Largely, people have the same needs wherever they live, and so I think that's potentially an interesting lever that might emerge over time as well, as in some sort of like universality for all of us as citizens across the UK.
Thanks, Laura. That's a really important point. And I think at Money and Mental Health, we have tried to think about these small incremental changes that we hope in part can add up towards bigger systemic change. So we want to see these incremental changes as steps on a path towards a system that works better for people. But we also want to work with friends and partners in the sector where there are organisations whose role is more to call for that wider systemic change. How can we support and add our voice and make sure that we are doing both of these things at the same time? So it's encouraging to hear that it feels like that is a helpful approach. And it is you know, as we're working for bigger systemic change, it's important that we do anything we can in the meantime, because there are people who are struggling right now, and we can't let them be the victims of political inaction or an inability to change wider system-wide issues. Which takes us on to this final really big question, which I think, Laura, you've started to add some helpful insight to, which is actually Stuart from Rainbow Money Advice in Barnet has summed this up really nicely in the questions, which was many difficulties that claimants have struggled with have been brought to the government's attention time and time again. Isn't this a political decision not to address them properly? Maureen has also added, when universal credit was first being framed, we told you the issues would cause problems. They didn't address them then, so how can we persuade them to make these changes now? Somebody else has said, how can we persuade the DWP given they have repeatedly refused to listen so far? I think my internet dropped out a little bit there, but did you hear enough about the questions for people to feel able to answer? Yeah. So this is basically, is it a political decision not to act? And how can we persuade politicians to do that, given it's so urgent? Laura's really helpfully already given us the example of devolution, where we can push for change happening in Scotland and elsewhere that might demonstrate a case in England or elsewhere in the UK. Does anybody have any further insight or ideas about how we make this change happen? Tom, I'm going to have to pick on you purely as having been in the DWP and understanding some of the challenges that we face. Is it a political issue why this hasn't happened, or is it just a failure of design and process?
I think it's a combination of both. I think what the sort of dynamic I saw within the department is that, you know, ministers and secretaries of state come into this department, and it's the biggest government department. It's incredibly complex. It spends a huge amount of money, and as you know, partly because there's such a kind of merry-go-round of ministers and secretaries of state, people come in and are a bit overwhelmed by it. It's a hard brief to get on top of, even if you've been there for years and years, let alone, you know, in the time that I was at DWP, I was there for 18 months, and I think there were 3 secretaries of state in that time and multiple ministers. So what happens instead is, and not in a kind of necessarily kind of intentional yes minister type of way, but the politicians are very led by what they're told by the civil servants, and the civil servants are very wedded to a system that they have created and that they run themselves. So there is this strange kind of internal culture where politicians are wary of kind of trying to change things too much in a complicated system with lots of moving parts. Civil servants kind of have a vested interest in not changing things too much because it's a lot of hard work and it's very complicated. And so you get this kind of stasis where everyone kind of has a bit of a vested interest in not rocking the boat too much. So I think it is about making, you know, for changes like this, it's about making a very specific, compelling case, ideally having an idea of how you could do it differently. And there will be people in the department who will just say, well, that can't be done for X, Y, and Z reason. And that's where the political pressure needs to come in, because those kind of barriers within the department where civil servants are saying it can't be done, that only gets overcome when there's sufficient political will to say, well, we have to find a way to overcome it. And of course it can be, you know, I mean, universal credit's an incredibly complicated system that was a complete revolution in how benefits are kind of delivered. And so, you know, the department is capable of doing complicated policy and delivery, but it's just about, is there sufficient political will to force that through?
I think it's also the current government's position is that we would be better off in work, although we actually know that it's good work that's good for us, not any work. But of course, mental health problems don't work like that. And lots of people with mental health problems would like to work, face widespread discrimination, get into the job market. So it's not as though there's an army of employers looking to welcome people with active mental health issues into the workplace on the one hand. But I think that is where that political pressure comes in. And I still think that it's something that, you know, it's so great to see people with mental health issues and carers' voices amplified in this report. And I think that's something that we can keep doing. It was great to hear Gary speaking earlier. He spoke so well about the challenges that him and his wife face, and just something that should be very simple. And also, let's not forget, it is actually our statutory right to benefits. If we're found to have an eligible claim, the state has a duty to award us those benefits. It's not a favour that the government or the system is doing for us. It's something that that we're entitled to. That's why it's called an entitlement to benefits. It's a legal right. And so I think amplifying those people's voices is really important. And I think that does also include writing to our elected officials. You'd be really surprised the amount of times people just say, oh, it's not a post-bag issue, by which they mean they don't hear from enough people. So if you run a service, invite people in to talk to you, invite people to talk to people that you support, whether that's in a group or an individual basis. Write those letters, sign up to those campaigns. And I think I know that the approach that Helen outlined and that Money and Mental Health are really so strong on, which is that partnership approach of, so what can we do in partnership together, and already involved organisations like Christians Against Poverty in that as well, can really have that kind of snowball, do I mean snowball impact, and can't think of my metaphor, but I mean, but when lots of people are working together, it can get more things done, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So I think, writing and keeping up the pressure. And I think these really specific examples about what we can do now. So just adding that help to manage option is a really good thing. And I think as Tom says, if you can provide government with a solution as well as a problem, I think that's really helpful. And often, charities can be a bit guilty of kind of shouting about the problem, but not actually shouting about a solution. And I think that's something that we need to show as well, which is why it's great to see there's such a concrete outlined recommendation here.
Thank you, Laura. I'm very aware of the time, and I'm going to make sure that we finish bang on 11, but I want to bring in Rachel and Nikki on this last question before we wrap up. But just, Laura, I think your snowballing metaphor was the perfect one. And speaking of snowballing, lovely tangent there, the petition has had over 400 signatures whilst people have been watching this event, which is really fantastic. But please do make sure that you sign up, because as Laura said, we want to make this a post-bag issue, and that is how we will get political support to make a difference on it. So please do sign up and add your name. You can do it during the event, or you can do it afterwards. So quickly, for the final word, over to Rachel and Nikki. How do we get political interest in this? Do you have any other suggestions or ideas for us?
I mean, this is a question of priority. We know, Nikki mentioned in your section that there was some really good work being done on this and it got parked. And understandably, the department has had a lot thrown at them in this last year, really being at the forefront of a lot of the COVID response. But there is resource there. It's just a question of priority. And I think often the message that's not getting through is how high stakes this is for people. This is their core income in many cases. And as Tom said, it can be all consuming in your day-to-day. Having to fight for a system like this. And I think, with, for example, the Keep the Lifeline campaign about the universal credit and tax credit uplift, I think it's just been really surprising how the claimant voice is not cutting through in that. There are millions of people in the universal credit system, and this is affecting them. And I think the more that we can get it through to our MPs, and then, escalating up to the ministers that this is something that matters to people's day-to-day, and it's incredibly important to their quality of life. The more priority that this is going to be given as it should be.
Thank you, Rachel. And Nikki.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said already. This is a question of priorities. That it was kind of on the agenda before COVID, and now it's about kind of do the DWP want to prioritise this? I think that the case that it needs to be prioritised is absolutely made and essential. Hundreds of thousands of people are at risk here, but also, if people can't engage with the universal credit system that they need to engage with, they're certainly not going to be progressing towards work, which is what the government are kind of trying to achieve. So they need to make it so that people can navigate the system, and these are incredibly small. The kind of first subset of our recommendations, at least, are small changes that they can make really, really quickly. It's a political decision to put the resources behind it to implement it.
Thank you very much, Nikki. So finally, some thanks from me and also a quick apology. So I'll start with the apology, which is I'm very sorry that there are no subtitles on this event today, and a couple of people flagged that they had struggled to follow because of that. We will make sure that we have subtitles on our future events. This is also going to be available for playback, and it will be fully subtitled when it is available on playback. I know that's not ideal, but hopefully it means you can at least catch up on the discussion there. So apologies for that from me. me. And finally, an enormous thank you. Thank you to everybody who has been watching. I think this is an unprecedented number of people watching one of our events, and it's far more people than we can normally get into one of our venues as well. So there are definitely some benefits to doing things online, and we're really pleased you could join us. When you do sign the petition, please click to opt in to be on our mailing list. We don't email you very often, but it does mean that you'll be notified about future events and research as well, and we'd love to keep you informed. And finally, a big thank you to Martin, to Tom, to Laura, Rachel and Nikki for speaking and being so generous with your insights and expertise. And of course, an enormous thank you to Gary. I hope that Gary is watching at home, but sharing your experience personally is always the hardest thing to do and makes such a big difference. So thank you very much. And we hope that we will see you all at one of our events in the future.